So I want to move now into a discussion of a book by Karl Jaspers, and I don't have a physical copy of it here with me, or I would hold it up. I'm reading an electronic copy on the other computer here. A book by Karl Jaspers that was published in 1949 called The Origin and Goal of History. And it's a book that sounds like a traditional old-fashioned grand meta-narrative, and in a certain sense it is so. But since it is a book that's written by Karl Jaspers, and Jaspers was himself a Heideggerian, it's not a book that was written in a kind of in any sort of naivete regarding Heidegger's project of the destruction of metaphysics. So it's done with full consciousness, and there are some Heideggerian terms that occasionally, such as being, for example, that Jaspers uses. Jaspers knew Heidegger, and he is regarded as the co-founder, basically along with Heidegger, of German existentialism. The two knew each other and cross-fertilized each other. Heidegger reviewed Jaspers' book, The Psychology of Worldviews, and that essay can be found in Holzwege, and he was very critical of it. But Jaspers drew a lot of ideas from Heidegger, and the two had a falling out. Jaspers was married to a Jewish wife, and when Heidegger signed up with the Nazis in 1933, the two had a falling out over that, and that pretty much soured their relationship. And in the 1940s, Jaspers moved to Basel in Switzerland. But Jaspers was marked by the Heideggerian terminologies, such terms such as existence and transcendence and being. These are all terms that Jaspers inherits from him. And Jaspers also had a subsequent influence on Gadamer as well. So there is a chain of tradition here extending from Heidegger through Jaspers to Gadamer. And though Jaspers is not usually talked about these days anymore, and I think that's precisely because of his interest in history and in grand meta-narratives, there's a pretense. You find this in the books of Gianni Vattimo, which I just finished reading a score of Gianni Vattimo's books. Vattimo has no knowledge of history. He's completely ignorant of history, and simply because I think he thinks that somehow historical meta-narratives are completely at odds with the Heideggerian way of doing things. And Vattimo is precisely a Heideggerian who is the representative, one of the leading representatives, along with people like Richard Rorty, of the hermeneutic school of approach that descends directly from Gadamer. Gadamer's Truth and Method was published in 1960. And in a way, I want to read through Jaspers here as a kind of leading into Gadamer, which I want to get to soon. So we have The Origin and Goal of History. And in this book, Jaspers introduces us to the concept of the axial period. This is a phrase you might have heard. You encounter it, you come across it a lot in books. And it was invented by Jaspers to refer to a very crucial period in history that dates right to about 500 BC, in which across the board, from China through India to the West, we get the appearance and advent of a new species of philosopher. A philosopher who is also, back in those days, the philosopher was not yet fully distinguished from the spiritual man, the man who created metaphysical systems. And in this case, these philosophers all are teachers of paths of self-salvation. They no longer believe in the official state religions that are sanctioned by an official priesthood in these crumbling, disintegrating city-states of this axial period. And this is precisely the period, and the reason why these philosophers come into being across the board here. In China, this is the period of Lao Tzu and Confucius, right around 500 BC. In India, we have Buddha and Parshvanatha, one of the Jain philosophers. And before him, we had Kapila, the founder of Sankhya, and before Kapila, the great philosophers of the Upanishads in 800 BC. And Jaspers basically draws the date at 800 BC for the Axial Age. He says it's a period that extends from 800 BC to 200 BC. It's demarcated with the advent of the Upanishads in India. And Yajnavalkya, as his name sounds, it has the word yuj, yoga, in it, was the one who introduced yoga to the Brahmin priests. And if you read the Chandogya Upanishad, which dates from about 800 BC, there's a great, wonderful contest where Yajnavalkya makes fools out of the Brahmin priests, basically, by introducing them to the concept of yoga, reincarnation, and the identity of Atman, one's breath soul, as it were, with Brahman, the macro soul, so that one is to experience through yogic techniques of inner exploration, Brahmatman, the oneness of the Atman with Brahman, and the individual who is in possession of these yogic techniques no longer has any need for the Brahmin priests. They become superfluous at this point. So these techniques of self-salvation, and Yajnavalkya is really the forerunner of the whole movement here, are a threat to the vested interests of the priesthood, who themselves are always built into the state apparatus. The state is an apparatus of capture. It captures souls and harnesses them through things like taxation and infrastructure and bonding them to in a state of infinite debt to the temple, captures them. And along with that, of course, the priesthood and the official state religion that sanctions all of this captures the individual. So the individual was in a very difficult situation in these days, and these philosophers come into being across the board, as we have said, China, India, and then in the West, this is also the period 500 BC of Pythagoras, 400 BC of Plato and Socrates, the great pre-Socratic philosophers, and in Palestine, of course, this is the period of the prophets. The prophets, like Jeremiah, Amos, they start with Amos and Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Deutero, Isaiah. All of these prophets are in opposition to the reigning priesthood of the Jewish temple, the Sanhedrin, who are tied to the temple and the official state religion that these prophets now regard as having gone corrupt. They can no longer be trusted. And notice that the prophets are wanderers. Lao Tzu is a wanderer, not tied to a state. Unlike Confucius, who remains bound to the state, Lao Tzu rejects it, turns his back on it, basically, and so does Yajnavalkya and the various ascetic yogin philosophers who wander through India. The individual, the great prophet and the metaphysician teacher at this time, is becoming detached from the polosphere. The polyspheric mode has gone into an exospheric mode and is detached and it simply wanders like a spore outside of civilization, and is basically a civilization unto himself, because he has all the techniques along with him for self-salvation. And salvation consists in a turning within, finding whatever the soul principle is, the light, whether it's the Atman or the Jiva in India, or whether it's the various ideas of the soul, with Plato, the finding of the soul, the reincarnation cycle, and the detachment from the senses, the detachment from matter. It's all cosmic, and it all has to do with the individual's confrontation as a microcosm over against the macrocosm. And the macrocosm is identified with the official state religion of the dying age that has preceded the axial age, which Jaspers calls the mythical age. And we note there that the mythical age and the axial age that follows it, the mythical age, Jaspers says, comes into being with the rise of the high civilizations, 3500 BC, and it's dying out and crumbling in full tilt disintegration 3,000 years later by the time we get to the axial age, 800 to 500 BC, which ends around 200 BC, according to Jaspers in this introductory chapter here. The introductory chapter is called the Axial Period, chapter 1. With the rise in each of these three domains, China, India, and the West, although the West is two cultural domains, the Levant and the Greco-Roman culture, with the rise of a series of empires. We get, in China, of course, 200 BC is the rise of the Qin Empire under Qin Shi Huangdi, who's the first great emperor of China, who unites and unifies all the various kingdoms of China into a single empire. Ashoka does the same thing in founding the Maurya Empire in India at about the same time. The Romans are doing the same time. All this 200 BC, in the beginning, this is the 200 BC is about the time of the Punic Wars, the issue of which will be the formation of the Roman Empire. And though Jaspers doesn't mention it, we should also mark this in Palestine as the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt, 160 BC. The Book of Daniel and 1 Enoch come into being as the basic apocalyptic literature of the Maccabean Revolt and the formation of a state. It's not an empire, but it is a state that comes into being at this time. So we get these empires that come into being that swallow up and engulf all the disintegrating city-states, and they become the final ultimate issue of all the great period of incessant warfare, what in China is called the period of contending states. And the period of contending states was a period in which the polis was in full tilt disintegration, and as the result of that, as Peter Sloterdijk says in his recent book, The Art of Philosophy, that the philosopher comes into being as the man who is dead to the world because he's in a state of suspended animation and thought, because his mind is detached from the world of samsara, the world of the crumbling state, the world of politics, and locked into a dialogue with the infinite, with the eternal, with being, basically. And he has the tools to teach you, since the priesthood can no longer be trusted, since the city-state that it supported is in disintegration, the individual is on his own here and has to find his own means of self-salvation. And all of these prophets come into being across the board to teach the individual a means of saving his soul from its infinite servitude to the state as an apparatus of capture, as the Luz would call it. So this is the axial age that Jaspers has sandwiched in between the mythical age and what he later calls the age of science and technology, which is, of course, the Heideggerian Gestell, the age of enframing. Now note that what Heidegger calls the metaphysical age, and the metaphysical age extends from Plato to Husserl, as he says, and which begins to end with Nietzsche and Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics, is very similar to roughly Plato's 400 BC, roughly, and it's very close to the date that Jaspers gives for the axial age. And I realized in reading this that the metaphysical age is simply the later development of all the consequences that are set up by the axial epoch in 800 to 500 BC. That sets up the consequences of which the metaphysical age is a fulfillment over 2,000–3,000 years almost, and which came to a screeching halt in the 19th century with Nietzsche, Marx to a certain extent, and also Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics. Nietzsche, who announces the death of God, and in Twilight of the Idols, he announces how the true world, that is this metaphysical world that these philosophers are capable of jacking into, like cyberspace in the novels of William Gibson, where the soul can leave the body and go into an infinite realm of being. That world is disappearing, according to Nietzsche, how the true world became a fable, after all. And since it is a fable, there is no longer for Nietzsche a place for this philosopher to escape to. There is no longer another world behind the apparent world for the philosopher to escape to, so he has to stay confined into his own skin. And that's the beginnings of the disintegration of this 3,000-year-long arc of the metaphysical age, the metaphysical/axial age that is extended here from 800 BC down to Husserl, basically. It's one giant epoch. And it ends there, and that enunciation of the death of God is also the enunciation of the end of the grand meta-narrative. And then with Heidegger, we get Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics, which is inaugurated by turning Husserl upside down. For Husserl, the philosopher was the man who is capable of epoche. That is to say, the epoche is the bracketing of the natural attitude for Husserl. The natural attitude is the naive attitude of the average person who's always involved in the world in some way. But for Husserl, you bracket, the true philosopher is the one who brackets that attitude and moves into a purely theoretical cognition, a transformation of the world into a purely theoretical entity. That's precisely, for him, the privileged mode that Heidegger then comes along in Being and Time and turns upside down and says, well, no, that mode of Vorhandenheit is not the primary mode. Our primary mode is actually the natural attitude, the existential mode. Our primary mode of being in the world is care and concern, and our orientation is vital in a life world, a Lebenswelt, and that is the world that we are in and involved in, and thinking about it is secondary development. This is consistent with the German tradition of the intellect being a secondary epiphenomenon of the vitalistic instincts and so forth. But that begins the disintegration of the metaphysical age that leads to Derrida. Derrida began as a Husserl scholar and became enraptured with Heidegger and borrowed Heidegger's destruction from him, and that becomes deconstruction, and we get the disintegration of the entire metaphysical edifice once and for all with Derrida and postmodernity in general, in which, as a result, you're not supposed to do any of this kind of grand metaphysical narrativizing that we're talking about here. But Jaspers' narrative that came out in 1949 is one of the last of these grand narratives, and I think it's an important one to look at to see how the metaphysical age is the direct outcome of movements that were set into being by the axial age as the result of the crumbling and disintegration of the mythical age. Note that Jaspers' dates that he draws for the creation of the axial period is basically the same thing as Gebser's mythical consciousness structure, or rather the mythical consciousness structure corresponds to Jaspers' mythical age. Gebser's rational mental consciousness structure corresponds to the axial age because it corresponds to basically the same period. The Greeks and the Hebrew prophets that Gebser talks about correspond precisely to his mental consciousness structure. And Rudolf Steiner also demarcates this period as the shift from the sentient soul to the period of the intellectual soul. So there is a definite epoch of agreement here, and also Willem Flusser and his discussion in his books that writing, and specifically alphabetic writing, came into being as a form of criticism of the mythical images of the preceding period comes in at about this time. So we'll leave it there for this discussion.